There's a tendency in the modern world to think of pharmaceuticals as something unique to our era. We have this idea of the miracle of modern medicine, something clean, corporate, and life-saving. Of course, there's the second understanding of it, that being recreational drugs, something less than legal, unfortunately trendy, and often addictive. But this ignores their historical role. These kind of substances have been with us for millennia, both medicinally and recreationally, but also in areas that we don't usually associate them with. Here, I'd like to run you through three unique instances throughout history, one from ancient Greece, one from the 1800s, and one from the Second World War. I'll tell you what happened, and I'll tell you how it happened. Without further ado, let's begin.
Μια Κυριακή πρωί, πω Μαρία, πω Μαρία, πω Μαρία, σ' αγαπώ.
The records of an oracle in one form or another exist in the area as far back as 1400 BC. What we typically think of as the oracle at Delphi only really came into existence around 800 BC. There, at a temple devoted to Apollo, there was this woman that they would designate as the oracle, and during certain rituals she would be overcome by convulsions and speak in strange voices, and according to the legends, be a channel to the gods and be able to predict the future. Mysteriously, this woman would only survive a few years after being designated oracle, upon which she was replaced. Now, popular theories as to why exactly these events occurred often spoke to vapors which would be inhaled by the oracle that would rise up from the ground through cracks, because this was over a cave system. And this would probably be things like ethylene, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and methane. And admittedly, these gases can asphyxiate people, which could have contributed to hallucinations, but there's a more recent theory which I think fits the myth almost perfectly. Now, one part of the ritual involved the oracle burning some local plant, and this plant was probably the Nerium oleander. It's a shrub, and it contains a compound that's called oleandrin, go figure. And chemically, you can see that it's made up of primarily a steroid, and that just means 4 carbon rings, 3 cyclohexanes, and a cyclopentane. And that group of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens down there, that's called a lactone ring. Now, this is a very toxic compound for a couple reasons. First, it's pretty similar to conicine, and that's another steroid which is very effective at penetrating the blood-brain barrier. And the other reason is that it is what we call a cardiac glycoside. Now, what that means is that it causes the heart to pump harder and faster, and it does this by bonding with and interfering in mechanisms in the sodium-potassium pump, which is involved in ATP. And this causes calcium to pull up in the cells, which would have been taken away by the sodium, and that leads to contractions. Now, oleandrin, given that, has a couple of fun side effects that include nausea, diarrhea, xanthopia, which means yellow vision, respiratory paralysis, and epileptic seizures. Now, you and I both know that the Greeks were taking advice from someone having epileptic fits. Honest mistake. Now, that's pretty bad, but at least it's not as stupid as
But of all the world's great heroes, there's none that can compare with the tow, row to the British Grenadiers.
While I'm sitting here piecing together this video, I'm enjoying a cup of Darjeeling, and I can't help but think about my second favorite thing that Britain stole from India, that being opium. Earliest recorded usage dates back as far as 5000 BC, and it's been thrown around over the ages from the Sumerians to the Greeks and Romans, all the way to the Arabs in Europe. But the part that I care about, for this video at least, is about the British East India Company's venture into the business. As the name suggests, the company essentially had a stranglehold on India, and they used that power to produce and sell tea, textiles, spices, and opium. And one of the less than savory business practices of said company was their marketing strategy towards China. In a bit of a macabre version of free samples, they essentially managed to get most of China addicted to opium, and they use this to essentially monopolize the trade. This got to the point that the Qing Empire criminalized it and banned its importation, which led to not one, but two wars over opium, both of which China lost. And this is pretty significant geopolitically because China lost Hong Kong, and this marked a general period of decline for the empire, which lasted into the Boxer Rebellion, which was another rebellion against foreign powers, which also failed, and eventually led to the collapse of the empire and the rise of the Communist People's Republic of China. Opium is extracted from the Papaver somniferum poppy, specifically the seed capsules. You can see them in the background there, those green bulbs over there. And it's made up mostly of latex, but it contains about 12% morphine, which is the part that people use it for. Morphine is an opioid, a painkiller, and as you can see on the screen, it's got an aromatic ring, an ether, a couple alcohols, and an amine. And it works by bonding to the body's opioid receptors in the central nervous system, and they're what trigger the release of dopamine, and that's what gives you the kind of rush. Now, the problem with this, and the reason it was addictive and wars were fought over whether or not England could sell it to China, is that over time, morphine shuts down the body's natural production of dopamine and its other feel-good chemicals, and as the brain keeps trying to find new sources of dopamine, you keep needing more and more opium, and that's what causes the addiction. And nowadays, opium's mixed with acetone and acetic anhydride. They react to make heroin, and that's a lot easier to ship in bulk, and it's a lot more dangerous, and it's part of the reason the modern opioid epidemic is so dangerous. It's got the same mode of action as morphine, but it's even more effective at penetrating the blood-brain barrier because of those acetyl groups, those two groups branching off from the left to the left of the morphine base. And because it is so effective, it's very easy to overdose on heroin, not to mention the stuff that dealers put in it that isn't heroin, stuff like sugar or starch or something really nasty like strychnine, which will almost definitely kill you outright. Bit of a tangent, but it's kind of interesting to see how the modern crisis relates to a bit of world history. And as for our final vignette,
Es brauchst uns ein Panzer im Schuld nicht dahin.
what's worse than Nazis? Nazis on meth. That is exactly what happened in World War II. So the German army needed a way to keep its soldiers alert under strenuous conditions, and over the course of the war they developed something that they called Pervitin, and this was their ideal war drug that they gave to their soldiers. It was just literally methamphetamine that they distributed usually to bomber pilots and tank crews, though their allies used it as well. In the Luftwaffe, it was called Pilotensalz, pilot salt, and in the Wehrmacht, they called it Panzerschokolade, tank chocolate. Most German field reports and letters to home, most of which were asking for more, spoke to its effectiveness in keeping soldiers alert even on little to no sleep, but the British and Americans tested it on their own soldiers and found that it caused, quote, agitation and impairment in long-term judgment, end quote, and it was not adopted. This obviously didn't stop the German army from using it, and it actually stayed in use until 1970 in West Germany and 1988 in East Germany. So methamphetamine was first discovered in 1893, and it was found as a racemic mixture, which is to say 50-50 mix of levomethamphetamine and dextromethamphetamine. Top and bottom rotates polarized light to the left and to the right, respectively. And it's usually synthesized either through a process called reductive animation or through the Leuckart reaction, which is up on the screen right now. It looks a bit complicated, but I think I can make out the formic acid during nucleophilic attack. Anyway, the methamphetamine works by being an agonist for a good handful of receptors in the body, which just means that it bonds to them and triggers their functions. And it causes dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, which is, is a kind of adrenaline, to be released. And as I'm sure you figure at this point, it it's got a good handful of side effects. Unlike pure amphetamine, which is what it's based on, at least chemically, methamphetamine is a long-term neurotoxin which damages the brain's serotonin neurons, and much like opium, which I talked about, it shuts down the body's natural production of a bunch of chemicals, and that leads to its dependence. Amusingly enough, methamphetamine is sold over the counter in the United States as a nasal inhalant for decongestion. And anyway, the short-term effects also kind of explain why it wasn't adopted outside of the German army. It causes pupil dilation, excessive sweating, mood swings, either low or high, blood pressure depending on like who you are and the dosage, blurred vision, dizziness, and the occasional psychosis, which obviously doesn't really mix well with combat. But for one reason or another, the German army kept producing and distributing Pervitin to its soldiers. With all that out of the way, I figured I'd close on probably my favorite story from this time, at least regarding pharmaceuticals, and it's one of the first documented cases of an overdose on methamphetamine. And it's kind of insane, really. The guy on the screen right now, his name is Aimo Alan Koivunen, and he was a member of the Finnish army, which was fighting against the Soviet Union. And this happened in 1944. He was part of a ski patrol, and he was the carrier of his unit's Pervitin. So Aimo's unit was fleeing a Soviet force, and he was kind of struggling with the bottle, so he decided to empty the entire 30-pill bottle into his hand and take the lot. Following this, he experienced a brief surge of energy followed by delirium and woke up the next morning having no clue what happened, separated from his patrol and with no supplies. He encountered and escaped the Soviets again, stepped on a landmine, and laid in a ditch for a week waiting for help. When none came, keep in mind this is with no supplies, he skied an additional 250 miles, at which point he was found and finally taken into a hospital. There, he was recorded as weighing 94 pounds and having a heartbeat of 200 beats per minute, having survived entirely on pine buds and a single jay that he had caught. Aimo, amazingly enough, survived the war and lived until 1989, 1 year after Pervitin finally fell out of circulation in the East German military. Coincidence? Maybe. Then again, he came from the country that figured out you could detonate landmines by playing the Saki Arvin polka over the radio.